One night, when the sea breeze remembered that autumn wasn't far away and so began to blow colder, Turner told Willis he wanted to take the tender out into the bay. The next dawn, Willis was at the dock with him, loading in a jug some cheese sandwiches and some corn muffins, then casting him loose, waving him out into the incoming tide. Turner's arms felt strong against the long, smooth swells, so low they were not breaking, the sea the color of the inside of a mussel shell. He rowed down past Coxhead, across the mouth of Atkins Bay, around Popham, keeping inshore along the line of the tiny islands where the tide was weakest, and finally up and around Small Point Head and Bald Head and into the New Meadows. He let the last of the high tide carry him up the shoreline, the long swells growing even smoother and lowering with the rising of the sun, until the tide gave its last gasp and settled down for a bit just as the tender tipped its nose onto the south point of Malaga, and Turner stepped onto it. The sea breeze found him and twisted around him like a cat asking for a bowl of milk. It followed him up into the island and didn't stop its play even when Turner went up to the Easton place, the burned ruins already cleansed by the winter and starting to find their way back into the woods. At the Tripp place, the sea breeze scattered last fall's oak leaves inside the outline of the foundation stones. At the graveyard, a few depressions, but otherwise the ground was filled with pine boughs and the snow had brought down. At the Griffin place, nothing at all. He could have stood there like Darwin at the Galapagos and known that if he had come 1,000 years earlier, everything would have been the same. He sat down on the rocks and looked out. When he had sat there long enough to see that the tide was beginning to empty out of the New Meadows, he rose and followed the shore of Malaga Island back to the tender. He got in and cast off, letting the tide take him out and away from the island, using the oars just enough to keep himself square to the swells. The island rocked gently as he moved farther and farther away from it, the chuckling of the water underneath the boat and the wood creaking of the oarlocks as unrhythmic lullaby. Rowing now and again so that he could feel the tautness of his muscles, Turner let the lowering tide carry him away from Malaga Island, down the New Meadows, and, sometime past noon, out into open water where the shoreline was a blue blur, the waves higher and longer, and the only company he had in the whole world was the sea breeze that followed him on out. Mostly he drifted, though once he rowed inshore ways to a spot where gulls were screeching and diving and trying to lift themselves back up into the air. But before he could reach them, they came out to him. Suddenly, he was in the middle of a school of shimmering blue fish, all of them turning to their sides to feed and waving their silver fins up into the strange air. The sea was so smooth it looked sleepy, and the tender, even when Turner rowed as hard as he could, left no wake. "Who's looking at things straight now?" he called out into the air. "I suppose you think you are." He could almost hear her, just as if she were sitting on the boat with him on the lonely ocean. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for whales." "That's a good thing to look for," she said. "I've seen some myself." "I guess." "I have. They look at you like they know things." "I know. Like they know things older than you could ever imagine." "I know, Lizzie. They look at things straight." "Are you looking at things straight now, Lizzie?" Her laugh was in the boat. "Golly Moses," she said, "I always did." Lizzie braked. And that was when Turner saw them, great mounds of water moving between him and the shoreline, following the coast. Above them, seagulls and black terns hovered and circled, screeching and cackling at each other until suddenly the mounds erupted and whales, 2, 4, 5, 7, oh good Lord, 9, rose out of the water like easy behemoths. Turner hollered, waving his arms and standing up in the boat until it began to rock with the waves the whales made. He rowed toward them in his excitement, slipping the oars out of the locks, setting them back in and slipping them out again, desperate to draw up alongside the whales, desperate to know what they knew. The whales waited for him. Sometimes they went below the surface and came up again, but mostly they waited for him and his puny tender. The gulls circled them like feathered halos until Turner shipped his oars and let the swells carry him. He could not tell if the waves were drifting him closer to the whales or if the whales were swimming closer to him. In any case, soon he was so close that when he held out his hand over the water, all he had to do was reach down and he would touch the dark gray rubber of the whale's skin, stretched to a perfect tautness, smelling of the deep sea. He felt more than saw the size of the whales and the deep knowing within them. He turned from one to another, their sea-washed eyes open and watching, and then finally he leaned out, and he touched the cool, wet, perfect smoothness of whale. Then he knew. Then he knew. The knowledge in his father's eyes and in the whale's eyes. The world turns and the world spins. The tide runs in and the tide runs out. And there is nothing in the world more beautiful and more wonderful in all its evolved forms than two souls who look at each other straight on. And there is nothing more woeful and soul-saddening than when they are parted. Turner knew that everything in the world rejoices in the touch, and everything in the world laments in the losing. And he had lost Malaga. So he wept. With his hand still on the whale and the whale's eye on him, he wept. He wept for old Mrs. Hurd, and he wept for Mrs. Cobb, and he wept for his father, and he wept for Lizzie Bright. In the open sea, with the land blue in his eyes and the sea green in his hand, he wept. And all around him the swells grew still, and the sea breeze quieted, and the perfect sky above him vaulted like a painted dome. Beneath him he felt the currents eddying around the bodies of the whales, felt the tides and shifting water that they created as they passed him, one by one, until the sea closed over the eye of the one who he was touching. And they had all lowered into the cool, wet, smooth sea, and they were gone. And still Turner wept. He wept until the sea breeze would have no more of it, and bucked the swells up, frothed them at the top, and sent some of the spray over the stern. Turner took the oars without thought and kept the tender moving into the waves. Then, again, without thought, he began to row slowly, rowing through the watchful ocean until the blue land changed to a gray and then brown and green. Then he struck the shore and turned south, keeping outside the breakers and inland of the islands until he found Popham and rowed up the shining waters of the Kennebec. He had floated in the ocean with whales. He had seen them and touched them. They had seen him and touched him. It was something to tell somebody, and for a moment he smiled at what Lizzie would say when she heard. Of whales and of Malaga I sing, he said. Then he remembered that she would never hear anything in this world again, so he had no one to tell of this thing most beautiful and most wonderful. The sun had almost decided to set by the time Turner reached the dock. The first stars weren't out yet, but they were close. The sea breeze had come up behind him, and the swells had started to tumble over themselves just a bit, pushing the tender stern along and letting it know that it was time to be safe abed. Willis was waiting, and he waved and helloed as Turner rowed closer. Turner wondered how long he had been waiting there. A couple of hurricane lanterns stood at the end of the dock, and Turner figured Willis had been about to light them. He rowed hard the last stretch. He didn't want to show how tired he really was. But when Willis threw out the line and Turner could hardly tie the knot, he figured Willis would know. And he also figured that was all right. Willis's outstretched hand pulled him up onto the dock. You still don't know how to tie that hitch. You go far out? I guess. Pretty calm. I suppose even someone from Boston could manage. You want me to break your nose again? Be still and carry these up with me. Turner picked up one of the lanterns and looked straight on up toward Phippsburg. A few lights were already glowing, and there was wood smoke in the air against the chill. He could see the cupola of Mrs. Cobb's house, the glass reflecting the reddening sunset. And there was the first star. Willis, said Turner, and he told him about the whales.